Imagine it for a second. The year is 1862, the American prairie, and in the middle of it, a steam machine as tall as a 5-story building is roaring. Beside it stands a man in a bowler hat, and he barely reaches the wheel. This is not fantasy. This is a real photograph from the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. And the strangest thing is not the size of the machine. The strangest thing is that just 20 years later, no one could really explain where it had come from or where it had gone. No clear drawings, no manufacturing plant, no engineer's name, only a photograph, only a giant wheel, several times taller than a man, and almost complete silence in the documents. Let's begin with what is known for certain. The 19th century is usually considered an era of steady progress. We are usually shown a smooth line, first simple mechanisms, then James Watt's steam engine, then locomotives, factories, the telegraph, and gaslight. Everything supposedly moved step by step, without leaps, without gaps, without mysteries. But the authentic archives give a different picture. Industrial catalogs, engineering journals, exhibition reports, and departmental records show not only the growth of technology, they show something else as well. Machines of enormous scale, systems of great complexity, projects that look too mature for their era, and that is already hard to fit into the familiar schoolbook scheme. This is not about one strange find. The sources bring up gigantic earth-moving complexes, floating factories the size of a warship, pneumatic urban transport systems beneath the streets of New York and London as early as the 1860s. That is, before the modern subway entered the standard history of technology. And one detail is especially unsettling. Many of these machines did not gradually become obsolete. They simply disappeared, along with their descriptions, along with their documentation, along with the names of their creators. To understand how strange this is, one must remember the era itself. The middle of the 19th century was a time of sharp contrasts. In London, there were literally two worlds. In wealthy districts, there were gas lamps, paved streets, glass shop fronts, and expensive carriages. In poor neighborhoods, just a few miles away, people crowded 12 to a room. Children went to work from the age of 6. Sewage often amounted to open ditches. Charles Dickens described all this so precisely that his texts were used in parliamentary commissions as evidence of real life. And in such a world, things happen that do not fit well with the level of everyday reality. A significant part of the population can barely read. Medicine is still debating the nature of infection. The horse remains the main means of transport for the overwhelming majority of people. And it is precisely at this time that machines appear, which, by a number of signs, are decades ahead of their age. Let us return to that very excavator. In one catalog from the Philadelphia exhibition of 1876, what may be the only caption has survived: Titan, Series B, and that is all. No manufacturer's name, no patent number, no surname of the designer. For the 19th century, this is highly unusual. Patent offices then worked pedantically. They registered everything, from household trifles to complex machine tools. And yet here the largest machine of its kind seems to emerge out of nowhere. But the excavator only opens the list. In 1853, New York hosted the first major American industrial exhibition. It became a response to the London exhibition at the Crystal Palace, which had taken place 2 years earlier. Among the exhibits was mentioned the great machine of Eli Whitney, Jr. It was a cotton processing complex covering about 1.5 acres. That is roughly 6,000 square meters. According to contemporary descriptions, once started, it worked almost automatically and required minimal human involvement. One correspondent wrote that people stood before this machine like ants before a living mountain. The comparison is vivid and strangely familiar. Almost the same expression appears in another document, much earlier. in the report of the British military engineer Thomas Coffin from 1823. He described a certain construction system that he supposedly saw in Egypt. Two texts, decades apart, and almost the same image. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but oddities hiding right in the archives. The fate of Whitney's machine is also shrouded in mystery. After the exhibition, it was supposedly dismantled and sent south to Georgia to work on cotton plantations. After that, the trail goes cold. There are no photographs of it in working condition, no reliable information about its installation, no notable mentions in the local press. The machine that thousands of people had seen in New York was as if erased from history. One could object that archives are often lost. And that is true. The Civil War between the North and the South, from 1861 to 1865, destroyed vast masses of documents. Paper burns, institutions collapse, record-keeping is interrupted. All of this is logical. But the problem is that similar disappearances also occur in the archives of countries the war did not directly affect. In Sweden, in Austria, in Japan, the Japanese case is especially revealing. In 1868, immediately after, the country opened itself to the active borrowing of Western technologies. The Japanese government invited British and French engineers. Among the imported equipment was a drilling unit of the Montgomery system. The machine was intended for driving tunnels beneath the urban quarters of Tokyo. According to descriptions by officials of that time, it was a steel structure about 73 meters long, and, if the records are to be believed, it could advance through rocky ground at up to 10 meters per day. That sounds almost unbelievable. Even modern tunnel boring shields in difficult rock often work within a similar range. In other words, we are not talking about a primitive device, but a very high-class system. And this is 1868. What happened next? In the Japanese archives, there are records of the machine's arrival at the port. There is information about its delivery to the site. And then silence. No decommissioning act. No detailed report on the end of its service. No data on its return shipment. In 1872, a brief note appears. The work was completed. The foreign specialists departed for their homeland. Not a word about the machine itself. If we look more broadly, the pattern repeats again and again. From roughly the 1820s to the 1880s, reports appear in different countries of complex mechanical systems that fit poorly with the familiar level of technology of that era. Steam excavators, automatic factories, underground transport lines, drilling complexes, floating factories, and far too often their story ends in the same way, not with modernization, not with gradual development, but with disappearance. A skeptic will say that the metal was sent for remelting. That is a reasonable argument. The 19th century was a harsh time. Unprofitable projects were shut down quickly. Old machines were cut up for scrap. But the remelting of iron does not explain something else. Why the drawings disappeared. Why no patent traces were preserved. Why there were gaps in the registers, precisely where the most unusual machines were concerned. And here we come to an especially important example. It is interesting because several independent sources have survived for it at once. Newspaper notes, technical descriptions, municipal testimony. And when you compare them, a very strange conclusion emerges. In 1869, the first pneumatic passenger tunnel really was laid beneath the streets of New York. It was built by Alfred Ely Beach, an inventor, publisher of Scientific American, and a man of very great ambition. His tunnel ran beneath Broadway, from Warren Street to Murray Street, only about 85 meters in total. A small section, but the idea was almost fantastical for its time. The car was moved neither by horses nor by steam. It was pushed by air. At one end stood an enormous fan. He literally blew the mixture into the tube and then pulled it back out. To the residents of New York, it looked like a glimpse into the future. The official story sounds coherent. The tunnel operated for several years. Then it was closed. And, in 1892, workers accidentally found it again while laying sewer lines. And they found it almost untouched. Inside stood a rail car. Nearby was a luxurious waiting hall. Not just a platform, but a room with expensive finishes, almost like a palace salon. But this is where the strangest part begins. In the documents, Beach requested permission not for a passenger line, but for a mail tunnel. A modest, technical, almost invisible facility. That was exactly what he received permission for. But he built something entirely different. Not a narrow service passage, but a full-fledged transport corridor with a striking station. How was that even possible? In just a few months, beneath one of the busiest streets in the city, almost by hand, at night, with the dozens of workers, and all that while driving a tunnel nearly 3 meters in diameter, complete with interior halls, decorations, and a fountain. There is an official answer. Beach supposedly used his own tunneling shield. The earth was hauled away at night by horse-drawn wagons. Everything was kept secret, so the project would not be blocked by political opponents. Above all, the people of William Tweed. It is a convenient explanation, and even a plausible one. But in the 1990s, during a subway expansion, builders came across yet another tunnel. It ran parallel to Beach's tunnel. It was wider, and judging by the masonry, it looked older. The most important thing is something else. It was not on any known plan. Not on a single one. One tunnel in the documents, another without documents, and this is no longer a local oddity of New York. By the way, if details like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but the most uncomfortable points in the official versions. A similar pattern appears in other cities as well. In London, during the construction of the early underground in the 1860s, workers repeatedly found ready-made brick tunnels with proper arches, too neat to be accidental voids. In reports, they were often called drainage channels or remnants of old development, but some of these passages had dimensions poorly suited for drainage and far too well suited for the movement of a small platform or cart. In Paris, while laying metro lines at the beginning of the 20th century, engineers discovered another level beneath the known catacombs. It lay deeper and was arranged much more regularly. A brief report has survived in the archive. The find was ordered to be filled with concrete so as not to delay construction. It is hard to determine who exactly signed the order. The official's name blurred in the ink. Whether that was an accident or not, we do not know, but the formula repeats too often. Discover, fill in, continue work, and here is what is especially gripping. Such records are found all over the world. In Chicago, in Berlin, in Bombay, in Shanghai. Precisely at the moment when major cities were growing at explosive speed. Underground, something strange was being found. And almost always it was described in the same brief way, without details and without any desire to investigate. Why? Two answers are possible. Either it was ordinary bureaucracy, hindered by deadlines and budgets, or someone really did not like it when builders asked too many questions. The situation is further complicated by the fact that in the second half of the 19th century, archives in many countries began to be centralized. Private records, local newspapers, engineering diaries were transferred into state collections. And later researchers repeatedly noticed gaps, entire stretches where documents disappeared or turned out to be clearly incomplete. The same years come up especially often. 1853 and 1854, 1866 and 1867, 1878 and 1879. Coincidence is possible. But there are becoming too many coincidences. One of the clearest examples leads us to London, to the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Crystal Palace was itself a marvel of engineering. It was assembled in just 9 months. But the machines inside are no less astonishing. Among the thousands of exhibits were gigantic industrial units, so heavy that the floors beneath them had to be reinforced. One of them, a marine pump of the Rainy system, was described in the official catalog as a machine for draining docks and floodplains. Its output was astonishing even by modern standards. About 1 million gallons an hour. That is roughly 4,500 cubic meters. For the middle of the 19th century, that figure is almost unbelievable. After the exhibition, the pump was sold to the trading house Bremack & Sons. After that, the trail goes cold. The company archives burned in 1863, and the fire occurred 2 days after a newspaper article asked where this giant machine had disappeared to and where it had been used. The author of the article soon left for Australia and never returned to the subject. And this brings us to the next knot in the whole story, to the gigantic construction projects of the 19th century. Not exhibition halls, but real work in the field, in the mountains, and in the rock. The clearest example here is the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States of America. From 1863 to 1869, the country laid nearly 3,000 kilometers of track through deserts, prairies, and mountain ranges. Officially, it was a feat of manual labor, gunpowder, and nitroglycerin. And that is true, but apparently not the whole truth. But the strangeness only deepens from here. In the reports of the Central Pacific Company, the Western contractor of the Great Railroad, the same detail keeps appearing. Steam drilling equipment for tunneling in the Sierra Nevada. It is mentioned often, but almost never explained, as if, for the authors, it was something familiar and not requiring comment. But in the private correspondence of the company's director, Leland Stanford, the tone is completely different. In one letter from 1866, he calls the device Wells' steam drill and writes something astonishing. The machine cut through 7 feet of granite in a single shift and did not break down once. That is more than 2 meters of solid rock in 8 hours. By manual methods, that volume would have taken about a week. And here the main question arises. Who was Wells? In the patent registers of that time, there is no such engineer. Neither in the United States of America nor in Britain. The name appears only in 4 of Stanford's letters, and almost nowhere else. Not in newspapers, not in technical journals, not in reference books. A strange picture emerges. A man whose machine could have sharply accelerated the construction of the greatest railroad of the era seems to have vanished from history. There is one more trace. In the archives of Congress, there is a letter without an exact date. Based on the paper and handwriting, it is attributed to the 1860s. The addressee is unknown. The signature is only a single letter, T. The author writes about a system of mechanical underground deepening and proposes using it not only in mines, but also in cities. That alone is already interesting. But the real mystery is hidden in the end of the letter. It says there that the system was restored according to principles from documents brought from Egypt by participants in the expedition of 1903. Precisely 1903, not 1803. That breaks the entire chronology. If this is not a mistake, then it means engineers got their hands on materials connected with far more ancient knowledge that was simply reread and applied anew. By the way, if details like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but the strange junctions of facts, archives, and forgotten technologies. From here, the picture becomes even more disturbing. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought back to Europe not only the Rosetta Stone. It carried out a huge number of drawings, descriptions, and, According to some reports, copies of mechanisms found in the underground galleries of temples. Some of the materials were included in the famous publication, Description of Egypt, which was issued from 1809 to 1828. But not everything made it into print. Some tables and drawings that had been planned for publication never appeared. In the early 1810s, a wave of mysterious deaths passed among the researchers. The official explanation is known: illness, harsh conditions, the consequences of the expedition. But something else is noteworthy. Several of the deceased specialists were engaged not in languages or architecture, but in mechanics and hydraulics. In the inventories of their papers for the National Library of France, drawings of mechanical systems based on Egyptian models were mentioned. Those drawings are not in the collections today, and almost immediately after that, Europe entered a period of sharp technological acceleration. In the 1820s and 1830s, steam engines became more powerful and compact. Metallurgy made a leap. Solutions appeared for which historians of technology still do not always find a clear chain of predecessors. This does not prove borrowing, but the time gap looks too convenient. The drawings disappear, about 15 years pass, and the industrial explosion begins. Why hide the source? There are several versions. The first is economic. Technological superiority in the 19th century meant colossal money. One successful patent could feed a family for generations. The second is political. To admit that some European machines traced back to Egyptian or even more ancient models would have meant striking at the idea of European exceptionalism. And that idea was then becoming a pillar of the colonial order. The third version is the darkest. Such technologies could have made labor, construction, and extraction far too cheap, and that would have undermined a system that rested on a scarcity of knowledge and on masses of cheap labor. But there is one fact that fits none of these schemes. In 1883, the American geologist John Wesley Powell published a short article in the journal American Naturalist. In it, he described horizontal cuts in the rock walls of the Grand Canyon. The cuts were too even, too regular. Powell cautiously suggested that this might be a trace of mechanical processing in the very distant past. There was almost no reaction. Several colleagues called the idea fantasy. One supported it very cautiously. Powell himself never returned to the subject. And yet the detail matters. Because similar horizontal cuts were later noticed during the construction of the Panama Canal in the early 20th century. They were found at depths of dozens of meters, beneath layers of ancient rock. In the work logs, the builders noted them dryly. Natural formation. Continue work. But in the personal diary of geologist Carlos Gorsi, who worked in the Panamanian Geological Service in the 1920s, there is a far more honest phrase. He wrote that he had seen hundreds of natural cuts in rock formations, and not one had such regularity. If this is nature, he remarked, then it is nature that was helped, and here we return to the main point. The problem is not that giant 19th century machines existed at all. The problem lies in three things at once. First, their scale often does not match the level of metallurgy and mechanical engineering usually attributed to them. When in 1851 a steam pump appears with a capacity of about 1 million gallons an hour, it looks almost like a leap across several steps at once. Second, documentation for such machines disappears not by accident, but in a suspiciously systematic way. Third, they are often not followed by smooth continuation. The technologies seem to vanish, and then have to be mastered again in the 20th century. This is what is called the amnesia of civilization. Not a pretty metaphor, but a literal falling out of knowledge from society's memory. Usually technologies disappear together with the civilizations that created them. That was the case with Roman concrete, Greek fire, Damascus steel. But here the case is different. The 19th century was a time of rising literacy, printing presses, archives, engineering societies, and industrial confidence. Preserving such knowledge was easier than ever before. And yet it disappeared. By the end of the century, it was the major scientific and engineering institutions that decided what was worthy of recognition and preservation. The British Royal Society, the French Academy of Sciences, American engineering associations. From the 1870s to the beginning of the 20th century, they filtered publications ever more strictly. Descriptions of rare machines were removed from reference books. References to unreliable sources disappeared from journals. Some engineers, after death, found themselves declared fantasists, and their works were withdrawn from public access. One example is especially revealing. In the 1880s, the engineer Etienne Louis Nameless created a series of underground transport machines for a Belgian coal consortium. According to contemporary accounts, they could work for years with almost no maintenance. For that era, it sounded nearly unbelievable. In 1889, Nameless presented his developments at the Paris Exposition. On the third day, his stand was closed without explanation. 2 years later, the engineer died under unclear circumstances. His archive was seized by creditors over a debt which, as the historian of technology, Jean-Pierre Marin, later wrote, had been artificially created through judicial manipulation. A similar story extends to urban infrastructure. In the second half of the 19th century, pneumatic mail systems were built in several countries. Under the streets, pipes were laid through which capsules with letters flew under air pressure. The London system operated from 1853 to 1941, almost 90 years. Similar networks existed in New York, Berlin, Vienna, Prague, Paris. Later, they were dismantled as obsolete. But engineers who studied these systems already in the 20th century noticed something strange. Some pipes were made from alloys with unusual resistance to corrosion. A 1868 report of the London Science Museum mentions a pipe made from an alloy to Brown's factory specification H7. What that specification was, no one really knows today. The factory ceased to exist in 1875. The documentation was destroyed in bankruptcy, but samples of the pipe survived. In 1995, British metallurgists examined one of them and found additives that were not considered typical for the industry of that time. One of the participants in the analysis wrote, briefly and harshly, Either there is an error in the study, or in the 1860s someone knew something about metallurgy that we still do not fully understand. That is why the hypothesis of ancient technological inheritance does not disappear. It is not proven, but it has not been definitively disproved either. It tries to explain several oddities at once: the excessively rapid pace of the leap, the disappearing drawings, forgotten engineers, traces of mechanical processing where they are not expected, and machines that appear too early, then seem to dissolve in time. But this hypothesis leads further, and the question here is no longer academic. It is disturbing. If the technologies of the 19th century were not a breakthrough from zero, but a restoration of old knowledge, then what was the original level? And if even fragments of that knowledge made it possible to create machines that were decades ahead of their time, then what were their originals capable of? There is no answer in open sources, and this silence itself looks too dense, too convenient, too much like not a gap in history, but the trace of someone's selection. Let us return to the photograph from the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. To the Titan Series B steam excavator. It is a machine with a wheel about 3 times taller than a man. In the 1862 photograph, a man in a bowler hat stands beside it, and he is not looking into the lens. He is turning away, as if he does not want to meet the camera's gaze. At first, that is what catches you. Then you notice the hands. There is a glove on the left hand. The right hand is bare, and on the back of it, a dark spot is visible. The image quality is poor. Magnification gives almost nothing, but the outline of that spot is strange. It resembles a gear, or a cogwheel. It could have been a burn. It could have been a tattoo. It could have been a brand. The symbol of an engineer, the mark of a mechanic, or a sign of belonging to a closed structure that had access to such machines. And this is where the story becomes even stranger. In 1876, at the Philadelphia exhibition, where the Titan Series B is mentioned in the documents, there was another exhibit listed as well. Number 487. The description is brief. A system for underground rock excavation without manual labor. In the official program, one word appears beside it. Withdrawn. Not canceled, not undelivered, not removed for technical reasons. Specifically withdrawn. That wording matters. It means the forced removal of an exhibit that had already been declared or already presented. Who gave the order? Exactly when? For what reason? The documents do not say. Now compare the facts. A machine for underground excavation without manual labor. The year 1876. And a sudden withdrawal without explanation. This no longer looks like a coincidence. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly the kinds of traces that are usually hidden in the margins of history. Other fragments disappeared in a similar way. The drawings of Egyptian mechanical systems vanished from the National Library of France. Brown's archive burned down 2 days after journalist Pete's article. The tunnel under Broadway was filled with concrete, without a clear report, and without any public explanation. Taken separately, this could be written off as the chaos of the era, but together they no longer form chaos, but a pattern. Someone was not merely keeping a secret. Someone was systematically removing the traces. Not all of them, but enough for the whole picture to break apart into fragments. And yet the fragments remained. In metallurgical reports, in geological descriptions, in private letters, in diaries, in old photographs, in cuts of rock that do not look like the result of natural weathering, in archival dust on shelves that had not been opened for decades. History rarely hides everything completely. It almost always leaves one clue, one artifact, one photograph. And the more carefully we look at these traces, the clearer a simple thought becomes. Official history is not the whole history. It is only the part of it that was allowed to be preserved. Everything else is still somewhere nearby, waiting for someone to ask the right question.